It's all out there. As they used to say, the truth is out there. It is. It's sitting there. The senator of Nevada, who started this whole thing, right? Harry Reid, was once asked, what documents does the government have they're not showing us, right? And Harry Reid's answer was, the documents are all there. You've seen them. You're just not reading them. The secret is there. It's been printed. It's available. Pay attention. It was one of the last things that he talked about in an interview with someone. So I remember reading that and thinking, right on, right? It's there. We're not looking at it because we have blinders on.
Welcome. I'm here with Peter Levenda. Peter, welcome back. It's been a while since we've last chatted, but I always enjoy talking to you.
Likewise, I'm glad you have me back, and we have a lot to discuss, I'm sure. So fire away.
Okay. I'm not even sure what angle to come at this with, given everything that's been going on in the last 3 months. I mean, I did my master's thesis on the Iran problem, and I did it for Ash Carter a long time ago. I never thought we would ever be stupid enough to do that.
No.
And we didn't do it correctly, but that's not what this is about. But there's so much going on right now, geopolitically, that just coming at it from kind of a little bit of an unconventional angle, how might, speculatively, a lot of this relate to some of the topics you talked about in your and Tom DeLonge's book?
Yeah. Particularly when we talk about Sekret Machines war, we're talking about a world that is not necessarily the cookie cutter version that Americans have, right? We're in the States, we have a kind of a tunnel vision where everything is concerned, where global conflict is concerned, and where the UAP phenomenon is concerned. We have this tunnel vision. We think the U.S., that America has all the answers, and it's concealing the truth alone of all governments on the planet. Mm-hmm. So we have this way of looking. It's sort of a knee-jerk reaction. When you're born and raised here, as we were, you're fed a constant diet of America's the greatest country. It's the most powerful country. It's this, it's that, and everything else. There's not a lot of room there for wiggle room. There's not a lot of space for us to look at reality from a different perspective. We were sort of brought up in this very narrow point of view. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of Americans hate hearing that because they think that they have the truth, right? And everybody else is stumbling around in the darkness. The problem is the UFO, UAP phenomenon doesn't care about that, right?
Right.
To paraphrase all the other people out there who use this phrase constantly, it doesn't care about your feelings, right? So you have a phenomenon that is just as easily making itself known in a country that we've never even heard of, most Americans, as it would be if it was taking place in Ohio or something. So we're used to the UFO phenomenon for us beginning in 1947, and it was in New Mexico, it was in Roswell, or it was in the Pacific Northwest with Kenneth Arnold, and the sightings that gave us the term flying saucers. So we're used to that perspective. Now we're being forced to look at other countries and their issues, right? And we think that these other countries are bothering us, we should just bomb them and everything will be fine. There's this kind of weird idea that we have growing up here. That this is the way it should be. This is the way things should be. I grew up a bit earlier than you. So I grew up with, the possibility that Russia was going to bomb us into oblivion. So we had air raid sirens. Every week there would be the sirens would start up and we would practice hiding our heads under our desks and that sort of thing. So we grew up with this constant threat that somebody was out to get us. And the only way to survive would be to take care of everybody first. And when you travel a lot, as I have, I think you have, as you've gone abroad, as you've been to foreign countries, you realize there's other perspectives out there. Mm-hmm. And those other perspectives don't take into consideration America being the best country on the planet, the strongest country, and the undefeated country, et cetera, et cetera. It's a whole different approach to reality.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
And they have their own UFO incidents. They have their own contacts. They have their own contactees. They have their own evidence. They have their own film clips. They have their own personal observations. I lived in Malaysia for a while and for years. And at one point, there was a UFO flap there, and a cigar-shaped UFO was seen over an airfield, I think in eastern Malaysia on Borneo. And it was covered in the national, the state TV talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
They just talked about it normally, like this was a normal thing that happened. There was a UFO thing. Everybody was kind of excited. It was cigar-shaped. Oh, gee, look at that. Nobody came out and said, you people are all insane. You're seeing things that wasn't there, right? This was state television in a Muslim majority country, remember, in Southeast Asia. And they saw it, and it was like, yeah, okay, now what? When I was traveling in Indonesia and I was researching other books in that part of the world, I came across more UFO accounts of people on remote islands in Indonesia talking about this happened and that happened. And people just sort of take it for granted, shrug it off. They have their own lens for understanding it. So now we're in this position where there's this tremendous, motion going on in Congress. And there's all this stuff, and there's the UAP, fact-finding missions and everything else that are taking place, and the government's getting involved in all of this. Like this is going to be the be-all and the end-all. But Russia's been having this. China's been having this, right? They've been having these discussions. Their militaries have. So we're not talking about that. So in Sekret Machines War, we try to give a little bit of a broader picture. We're saying, here's a chapter on Russia. Guess what? Russia's been having really a lot of UFO contact experience that we're not really taking advantage of because we're enemies, right? So we're not listening to them. And China's had their own issues. They've had a large UFO contactee thing going on in that country. There have been Chinese scientists studying it. Their foremost rocket scientist was a guy who used to work for us until we called him a communist and all the rest of it, and put him under house arrest and then traded him for some Korean spies. This was a guy who helped jumpstart our space program. He worked with Theodore von Karman. He was a guy right at the beginning of JPL, right? But he was Chinese, therefore, in the McCarthy era, he was
also like oddly tied to Jack Parsons too.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah, they were part of the same team. They were part of that same rocket team, with Frank Molina and Ed Foreman and everybody else out there, shooting rockets into the air. He was part of their team. He was part of the von Karman team. So yeah, he was part of all of that, right? But we just basically told him, you're Chinese, you must be a communist. So eventually Chen said, okay, I'm going to China. See you, right? And we said, no, you can't go. You can't go. You have too much information and everything else. But then our government got involved and said, no, there's some agents, some spies we're going to trade him for. So they traded Tian to China, and Tian in China looked around and said, I'm going to jumpstart your space program. And that's what he did. The Chinese have a missile program and a space program because of the guy we kicked out of our country. Let that be a lesson, a little morality tale for us right now in this present day. We're going to be kicking people out that are really going to cause a lot of potential damage down the line because, number one, we've alienated them. Number two, they're brilliant. But, for one reason or other, ideological, political, or something, we're going to get rid of them. As we got rid of Oppenheimer, as we declared him to be persona non grata, we said he's a communist, right? Because his brother went to a communist meeting, right? Mm-hmm. So Oppenheimer gets kicked out. The guy who invented the atomic bomb to protect us.
He didn't get kicked out of the country. He just lost his security clearance.
He lost his security clearance. He was not allowed to work, which is basically getting kicked out.
Which is insane.
It's insane. Yeah. But we brought in the paperclip scientists from Nazi Germany, the tune of 1,000 of them. That was okay. The enemy that tried to destroy us, that was okay. But Oppenheimer, oh no, he's a communist. We've got to get our priorities straight here. We've got to understand things a little bit better than we do.
And I think you also went into, it wasn't just the rocketry program. It was like bio programs, like some really sick, twisted stuff.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Chen was crazy, man. This guy, maybe because of his background, maybe the way he grew up in China, I don't know. Maybe the exposure to Jack Parsons and his off-the-wall ideas. Chen goes back to China and starts getting involved in experimenting with qi, in Tai Chi Chuan, the energy that goes through the body. He starts experimenting with all kinds of stuff and then eventually moves over into the paranormal and says we can use the body to sense other objects without actually being near them. We can do all this remote viewing stuff. He was doing all of that we were doing in the army here. He was already doing that for the Chinese. And don't think the Russians were not aware of it, right?
Right.
The Russians had institutes that were studying this stuff. They had Russian generals who were aware of it. They said, well, the Chinese are doing it, the Americans are doing it, we got to do it. And we were all doing the same thing. So everybody was scared that the other side was getting it. Either psychic powers, the whole brainwashing thing that went on during the Korean War when we thought there was some mysterious force that the Chinese, the Russians had that could, control the minds of men or something. So there was that going on. And there was the paranormal research in general that was going on. And at the same time, parallel to that was UFO research. And Falun Gong, right? Very famous movement, a sort of mystical exercise, quasi-mystical movement in China, which is banned now in China. Falun Gong was started because, in a very similar way to Scientology, that there was a mystical and a UFO connection to mankind. And this UFO connection was like the secret that they kept from the lower level initiates till they got higher up. And it was all about UFOs, as I pointed out in Sekret Machines War. So this was actually a thing that all governments were involved in to one extent or another, even if they didn't have a space program, even if they didn't have, a rocket of any kind, or they didn't have any assets in space. They were still involved, number one, in the UFO research capacity because they were being effected just like we are. And number two, in the paranormal research, because they saw this was somehow connected. And in 1952, as I point out in the book, because of the overflights in July over Washington, D.C., the Air Force was forced to respond in a press conference to all these reports of UFOs.
This is Stanford?
Stanford, yeah.
Yep.
And Ramey was there. And so the guy from, Roswell. So these guys are all in this press conference, and they're being asked to explain the UFOs, and all they can do is fall back on stories from the Bible, ghost stories, seances, and ESP. They connected it right there in 1952. And today they're making a big deal. Why? Could there be a consciousness connection to the UFO? Is there a paranormal connection? The Air Force told us there was in 1950 freaking two, right? It was already on the books. It was there for anybody who cared to look at it, to pay attention. So what we're doing now with the global conflicts that we're involved in, there's another aspect to it. There's another dimension to all of this that we can't ignore. We don't know to what extent other countries, and by other countries, I don't just mean Russia and China. I mean Lebanon, Syria, Israel. Any of these countries are making use of paranormal research and paranormal abilities, right? In some cases, their culture is much more open to it than ours is. Because here, there's pushback. There's pushback in Congress from a lot of Christian fundamentalists are against even studying UFOs because they think it's something demonic. That's been covered in the regular press. I've talked about it. It's been covered in our books. There's this pushback because of a kind of fundamentalist Christian attitude. But there's other countries that don't have that issue. And in Islam, they're kind of used to stories about the jinn, about beings that exist in a dimension roughly parallel to ours. They're here, but we don't see them, right? So Islam has that. In Indonesia and Southeast Asia, they have similar ideas, similar stories. They don't see a problem with trying to accommodate this with the UFO phenomenon, or even with state-sponsored research into these activities. So we're at a loss, kind of, because our ideology is giving us blinkers. We're not really seeing the whole picture. And we kind of hope with Sekret Machines War that what we would do is kind of open the door to some of those questions, if not the answers, but to get people interested in asking these questions, to think outside of the box. Because right now we're kind of caught in this kind of struggle domestically in the United States where we're thinking only in certain terms and certain players on the national stage. And that's, to us, that's the entire program. That's the entire story. And it by no means is.
Why do you think the U.S. developed this way in terms of, because part of it was the creation of the term conspiracy theory was basically the CIA, where there's this effort to, and I think this is independent of religious belief and things like that. There were systematic campaigns to discredit people who've had sightings or who've interacted with these entities. So there's another facet to kind of the reason we can't engage in this. Is there any baggage from that, or is it still ongoing and also influenced by the religious right? Like, why is the U.S. so different in terms of engaging this topic?
Well, in the first place, the religious right is one of the problems. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French tourist, let's say, who came to the United States in the 18th century, said very famously in his book about America that religious insanity is very common in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that was then, that was more than 200 years ago. He was writing about that. So we have this ideological thing. Our country was founded by people who were fleeing what they felt to be religious persecution. But some of these people were, kind of out there religiously. They had very strange views already. So this was just a breeding ground for them. They could do anything they wanted. Their belief was that the Native American, the indigenous populations here, because they were not mentioned in the Bible, could not be human beings. Therefore, they were demons. Cotton Mather wrote about this. Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan, guy from the Salem witchcraft trials, right? From his point of view, they could not be human because they're not mentioned in the Bible. Black people are kind of mentioned, Asians are kind of mentioned, white people are kind of mentioned, but the American Indian, the indigenous people, the tribes here were never mentioned. Therefore, they don't exist as humans, right? That was like the beginning of this whole ideological move to say, well, this therefore is our land. There are no humans here, right? So this kind of this attitude, and I write about this in other places, that America is basically a haunted house. Mm-hmm. We have never paid attention to what was happening here before we got here. So we're living in an old Victorian mansion with an attic and a basement we're afraid to go into, right? Because the secrets that are there, the horrors that are there, would turn our hair white. Well, mine's already, but you know what I'm saying. This is really insane stuff. There are burial mounds across the country, huge edifices that were built that we sort of build over, that we ignored, bigger than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge. There's stuff here that goes on very, very far back. So we're walking through a haunted house and we're trying to make sense of who we are as Americans. Until we can really make a connection with all of that, we're sort of whistling in the dark. Carl Sagan used to say that, science was like a candle in the dark. And my objection to Carl Sagan was, well, science is like whistling in the dark, right? We don't have the whole story yet. We're afraid to look at the whole story. And until we do, we're going to have this problem. We're going to have different ideologies competing for control. They're not based on anything really real. They're not even based on scripture for the most part. If you're really, I have a degree in religious studies, right? So, my background was studying the Dead Sea Scrolls and things of that nature, biblical sources and all of that. And I wrote a couple of books about that, Stairway to Heaven being one of them, about Jewish mysticism, rising on the plains, going on, ascending to the stars. There's, a disconnect between what we're seeing in a lot of the sort of fundamentalist ideology we're hearing and the actual root sources, biblical sources and apocryphal sources as well. There's a major disconnect going on there. They're saying things that are not in scripture. They're promoting ideas that are not in scripture. So this is giving us a greater sense of disconnection, I think, because we're taking the word of people. We're hoping that they're telling us the truth, right? Because we don't have the time or the energy to find out if they're telling us the truth. And information is coming at us at such an enormous rate that we can't filter out the signal from the noise. So this is making us crazy, right? We're constantly hearing noise. It's like being a prisoner where they're constantly playing music 24 hours a day. You start to lose your mind, and we're kind of losing it here. We have to stop, take a breath, and think, is this really what is intended for our country? Is this what the founding fathers intended? And, is this what we want as people? This is a problem. We're having to juggle too many conflicting ideas. When it comes to the UFO phenomenon, the impact of that is there's something in the sky. It sits there, and you get 10 different people with 12 different ideas as to what it is. Mm-hmm. And everybody's fighting each other over their ideas. Nobody's listening to anybody else, right? We're not listening to the scientists. The scientists are not listening to the consciousness side of the equation, right? Nobody's listening to the religious people. And so you get this kind of the blind men and the elephant, which is my favorite metaphor for this. So everybody thinks they know what the elephant is, but they don't. They only have a piece of the picture, and we need everybody to cooperate. And in this environment, we're not getting it. That kind of cooperation is not happening. We need it because we don't know what that is, but we all have a piece of it, not just us here. in the United States, but us around the world. Everybody's got a piece of this. Everybody has seen it from a different perspective, a different angle. They have different information to impart, but we're not talking to them because they're evil, right? Because they're socialist or communist or because they're this or they're that. So we have all these, or they're Muslim or they're Buddhist or whatever. So we have ways of denigrating the source of the information. So we don't listen at all to what's coming at us. We've already branded these sources as being suspect, whereas ours are not suspect for some reason. Until you get a little bit deeper into Congress, then everybody's suspect of everybody else. And we begin to realize nobody's got the monopoly on truth here. Guys, nobody does. If we would just shut up for a little while, listen to everybody, listen to the sources, pay attention, not just to American, but foreign sources, we'll start to put this picture together. It's all out there. As they used to say, the truth is out there. It is. It's sitting there. The senator of Nevada, who started this whole thing, right? Harry Reid, was once asked, what documents does the government have they're not showing us, right? And Harry Reid's answer was, the documents are all there. You've seen them. You're just not reading them. The secret is there. It's been printed. It's available. Pay attention. It was one of the last things that he talked about in an interview with someone. So I remember reading that and thinking, right on, right? It's there. We're not looking at it because we have blinders on. So yeah, the consciousness thing, pretty old, right? The link to UFOs is pretty old. And in Sekret Machines, we've gone through 3 volumes of trying to show why that is. And I know it's heavy lifting, right? These books are not meant for this generation, probably, which really wants quick answers and a quick read, but deliberately so. We're not trying to tell you what's right and what's wrong. Mm-hmm. That is expressly not our intention here. We're not trying to say, listen to us, we have the truth. Not at all. What we're trying to do is say, why don't you ask these questions? Did you think about this? Did you think about that? Without drawing too many conclusions, just saying, think about these things. These are people
even just laying out the synchronicities of how, or maybe they're not synchronicities, maybe they're coordinated, what have you, but all the folks involved in the, seance, right? Yep. Were somehow related to the Kennedy assassination, which was there's all these bizarre connections that you don't have to have a conclusion. You just have to say, that's kind of odd. We've talked about the 9, I think, in the last time, the Council of 9, and Andrej Puharich, right? Right. Another interesting figure that's connected to all this, but it's all connected.
A government figure, right?
Yeah.
A government guy. I mean, he was in the military during the Korean War. He lectured on the paranormal and weaponizing the paranormal at Edgewood Arsenal, right? I mean, this was a guy that was deeply embedded in all of what was going on. He was a guy that was talking to scientists around the world. He discovered Uri Geller, right? Brought him over. He worked with Peter Hurkos, all these psychic detective types. He built Faraday cages. Did we mention the last time that Perry Mason episode? You can go and look for this Perry Mason episode of the old Perry Mason show. Andrea Puharich plays himself in one episode. And it's a test of psychic abilities. And he builds a Faraday cage on set. So there's Andrea Puharich as Dr. Puharich conducting this kind of research because he was a friend of Earl Stanley Gardner, who wrote the Perry Mason series. You can't make this stuff up, right? So only a few years after the seance with the 9, within 10 years, Andrea Puharich is on national television talking about the paranormal and how you test for the paranormal, Zener cards and the whole 9 yards. So he's doing all of this at that time. So this was a popular figure at one point, very embedded with the U.S. military, doing a lot of very strange experimentation. And somehow he's like 2 handshakes away from Lee Harvey Oswald, right? So we're not trying to say, take a breath. We're not trying to say that Andrea Puharich was involved in the Kennedy assassination. What we're trying to say is, look at that. What does that mean to you? What inferences can you draw, right? And then look at the other extensions of that, of everybody else that was involved, because at that seance of the 9 was, the guy who invented the Bell helicopter, right? And his wife, who was a Forbes, by the way.
Yeah, Arthur Young, right?
Arthur Young, yes.
Yeah.
His wife was Ruth Forbes Payne Young. I mean, those 3 names alone, Forbes, Payne, and Young, they were all like very important people in American history. So you have all of that happening. And their daughter-in-law was Ruth Payne, who was living in Texas, who leased out, or not rented or leased it, but loaned her apartment, her house, to Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina and their kids, right? And helped Lee get the job at the Texas School Book Depository. I mean, what? Right? And she goes and visits Arthur Young only 2 or 3 months before the assassination at his home in Pennsylvania. So what was she talking about to the Nine, right? To Arthur Young and Ruth, who were two members of the Nine right there. What was she talking about? She had a Russian defector in her house that she was helping get a job, right? A Russian defector and his wife.
One of the people in this circle had the ear of one of the Dulles brothers too, right?
That was Arthur Young's wife, Ruth. Her best friend was the mistress of Alan Dulles. So imagine the pillow talk, right? So, I mean, and then Dulles is the guy who's investigating the Kennedy assassination. He's part of the conveniently, right? Yeah. He's conveniently part of the commission. And he's the guy present when Ruth Payne from Texas is being interviewed about the assassination. As soon as she starts to mention Arthur Young and all of that, Dulles shuts her up, changes the subject, and you're reading the statement and it's gone, right? She doesn't talk about it anymore. She doesn't reveal the existence of Arthur Young or Arthur Young's wife, who was the best friend of Alan Dulles' mistress. The whole thing is very messy, right? But you think about that, you look at poor Lee Oswald. I know we're getting off topic, but it's just so fascinating to me. You look at Lee Oswald, he didn't have a chance, right? I mean, he has Ruth Payne, letting him live there. She's getting him his job at the Texas School Book Depository. And eventually she later, puts the last nail in, because she's the one who says, oh yeah, he had a rifle here and he had this notebook and he had all this other stuff, right? She basically hands him over. Doesn't get him legal representation. He asked for legal representation. These were people who were very ACLU oriented. They were Quakers. They were against violence and all the rest of it. You would have thought the first thing they would have done was get a lawyer for Lee Oswald. Never happened. Never had a lawyer. Okay. So all of this goes on that side. But look at all the other people involved with Lee Oswald. David Ferry, Jack Martin in New Orleans, right? Members of weird churches who were fronts for intelligence operations. I mean, the guy was coming and going. The guy was surrounded by some very strange, esoterically minded people from as soon as he stepped back into the country. So what we do in Sekret Machines is ask you to get all this on board, right? Don't think that one answer is going to answer everything. Don't think there's a simple answer to all of this. There are tendrils that connect to all different kinds of other things happening in our history. The UFO phenomenon is just part of it. Guy Bannister, who knew Lee Oswald, right? And David Ferry and Jack Martin. So here's Guy Bannister, who was in the FBI in 1947 on the Pacific Northwest investigating UFOs for Hoover, right? He was sending telexes, they're like telegrams, back to Hoover, saying, I talked to this contactee, I talked to this guy, I talked to these people about this sighting, on and on. Hoover wanted that direct input from Bannister. Bannister retired from the FBI, opens a detective shop in New Orleans, which becomes kind of the address for the Fair Play for Cuba committee that Lee Oswald was handing out the flyers for. David Ferry was there, Jack Martin, all these guys were there. They were all investigated later by Jim Garrison in the famous movie JFK. So all of these people knew each other. And the circle got tighter and tighter because it wasn't just Guy Bannister with the UFO phenomenon. It was also Fred Martin. Oh, I have the name correct. I'm now spinning. Yes. On the Pacific Northwest with the famous Fred Krisman, sorry.
Oh, yeah, Fred Krisman. Yeah.
Fred Krisman, right? Super spy. Yeah. The weirdest story, right? The UFOs in distress, Maury Island. There he is, Krisman. And he's doing his UFO thing over there in 1947. Well, by 1967, he's being interrogated by Jim Garrison's people in New Orleans because of his potential involvement in the Kennedy assassination. This is how I got into this whole subject, was researching the Kennedy assassination and finding all these UFO people involved, right? Mm-hmm. Even if peripherally. But these were not just UFO fanatics. These were not just UFO fans, people who would read UFO books. These were central characters in America's 20th century UFO history, right? Fred Krisman, Guy Bannister, Arthur Young, right? I mean, he went to found a kind of society for investigating paranormal phenomenon. He wrote about astrology. He wrote about all kinds of mysticism. Arthur Young was out there, right? But he was a very highly advanced engineer who gave us the helicopter, the Bell helicopter. Mm-hmm. So, you know, all of this starts to get together, and the circles get tighter and tighter and tighter and smaller, and everybody seems to know everybody else at a certain point. Again, there's nothing there that we could take to a court of law and say, Your Honor, you know, we have the facts, we can prosecute so-and-so. It's not that kind of evidence. And the UFO evidence is not that kind of evidence. And until we can sort of relax into the subject and start to see how things connect, we're going to be sort of banging our head against a wall, looking for something that we can take to the bank or take to court, because there's something else happening here. And obviously it has a lot to do with consciousness. But if we put consciousness in a separate box, we're making a mistake again. Consciousness is religion, is politics, is science. You know, this is a connecting link between all of this, and each one affects the other. Consciousness is affected by and does affect these areas of life, all culture. So we have to look for the consciousness aspect in the UFO phenomenon. Otherwise, we'll never get the whole story. We throw up our hands in despair because the science is not sciencing the way we want it to.
Well, it's almost like you have to assume that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of nature below, say, the physical layer, and it just kind of extends upward. And you can get there by the experiments certifying the observer effect, right?
Right.
Where, you know, to some extent you can shape reality, or at least you can shape where the electron that you're observing, it's going to go where you're observing it, as opposed to the probability distribution that, you know, you would get otherwise if you weren't observing it.
Right.
So it's almost, I think you look at Tom Campbell, I think would be evidence to him of a simulation of some sort. Mm. But regardless, when you look at the Council of Nine, just to kind of delve into that a little bit more, whatever that is, it's almost as if there is something non-human, or maybe another phase of humanity, post-death, who knows, that is subtly influencing the kind of the shape of things around us. I'm just speculating here, but you look at, take the connections between the Kennedy assassination and, for that matter, the Forrestal's assassination, right? Like, that could be in some way tied, because I mean, as an example, some of the people who visited him when he was in the hospital, John F. Kennedy visited him when he was a congressman, right? So going back to the Nine, it's almost as if there's something weaving a web, a very intricate and interconnected web that is influencing, let's just say, the scale of geopolitical and political events, at least in the United States and probably globally.
Number one, globally, that's true. This is not an American phenomenon. Uniquely, it's a global phenomenon. You can talk to people in other countries about, just pick assassinations, famous assassinations in foreign countries. There was an assassination in Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto, and then you draw the connections between that assassination and other events that were taking place, individuals that were involved that should probably never have been involved, or the attempted assassination of a pope in Rome by somebody who had connections that were very mysterious to secret organizations that were not just political but esoteric. But you have this kind of phenomenon that's worldwide. If you're looking, however, to place the blame somewhere, you're going to be grasping at smoke, right? Mm-hmm. Because once again, the evidence is not there that you could take to court. We're assuming facts, not in evidence, as they say. So there's a lot of facts. We've got a lot of facts, but we can't tie them together yet because we're missing something important. And maybe it's because we're looking in the wrong place. We're looking for a prime mover. We're looking for somebody who's sitting back there, like in the Matrix, for instance, somebody who's sitting there and who's pulling strings. If it's not a person, it's an organization or it's a force. And it may not be that simple. It may be something at once more complex and even more simple. It could be just a web of, I hate to use the word energy, it's such a vague word, but a web of something that unites events with people, with consciousness, with time and space. Along those lines, a word from our sponsor, there's a book coming out, I believe the end of this year, by A.J. Hartley, and I think Tom DeLonge's involved as well. It's called Time Rider. And it's about an attempt from someone from the future to do something concerning the Kennedy assassination, right? And it's based a bit on sinister forces. I had long talks with everybody, on this particular subject for this particular purpose. So it's kind of a fictional take, and it's coming out. I think it was already announced, so I'm not letting the cat out of the bag. But it's something that you might want to look forward to, trying to contextualize what we're talking about in a narrative way, like we did with the Sekret Machines novels, trying to contextualize this as a story so you could follow some of the ideas to their conclusions. So the same idea, right? We're talking about a sinister forces kind of take on this. People used to refer to sinister forces, they still do, to blame things that are going on, right? So the Oval Office tapes of the Nixon administration, for those of you who remember Watergate, there was a famous 18.5-minute gap in the Oval Office tapes. Nixon had a recording of all the meetings that he ever had in the Oval Office. But one crucial tape was missing 18.5 minutes. And I think he was his chief of staff at the time, Alexander Haig, blamed it on sinister forces, right? It's so amorphous, it's so bizarre, that you can't really argue with it. He just said, well, it was sinister forces were involved, which could have meant anything. It could have meant people. It could have meant electromagnetic pulses. It could have meant anything, right? Sinister forces. So that's why my trilogy was titled that way, based on the Alexander Haig quote. And then I found everybody was using it, right? MacArthur was using it to refer to sinister forces in space that might be threatening our.
Oh, this is the 1961 West Point speech.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
He refers to sinister forces. Right. So I thought, okay, we're on the right track. Even Inspector Clouseau and the Pink Panther saw there's been sinister forces afoot, So I said, yes, okay, good. So yeah, there's a lot of references to this, and nobody seems to know what it means, but everybody kind of knows. And that's where we are with this. Everybody kind of knows that there's something going on. We kind of know that there's something bigger than we can see, something behind the scenes that's causing these things to happen. What we don't really fully realize is that we may be part of that which is causing these things to happen. We're part of that web. We're part of consciousness. We're an integral part of consciousness. We may be, consciousness may be the universe looking at itself, as some people have said. So we may be feeding into this very thing that we're afraid of. We are inextricably involved with it. And so we're asking these questions in the Sekret Machines books for that reason, because I know somebody out there is going to be reading these books and coming away and saying, wait a minute, something just clicked. I know how we can answer this, or we can at least get to the next stage. Somebody will. Maybe not soon, maybe later, but it's there. I think all the pieces of evidence are there for somebody who can follow these sources and start to collate them and turn them into something, because Sekret Machines war is about war. It's about conflict, and we're right in the middle of this now, right? We're edging up to the edge of a precipice. And it's about conflict. It's about how we understand conflict. It's about how we understand warfare, how we understand the enemy. And it's really about colonization, because that's the thing that the most paranoid of the UFO believers is afraid of: colonization, another species coming to colonize this planet, to colonize us. And so we raise that question in Sekret Machines. What does it mean to be colonized? And the only place we can find the answers to that is to ask the people who have been colonized, if they're still talking to us. So we have to go to those countries that we've invaded. And by we, I mean everybody, right? Europe, Asia, the United States, whatever countries that we've collectively invaded, how we've brutalized local cultures, brutalized local indigenous populations, how those populations resisted, what did they retain? What did they feel they could get rid of as long as they held on to something? What was that something that they retained in these cultures? What was the most important thing to them? We had that very conversation that took place between the Dalai Lama and a group of rabbis who went to Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama is located. He wanted to ask them, how do you maintain your identity in diaspora? How do you do that? How does that happen? How does that work? Because the Dalai Lama faced the same problem. His entire community basically is in diaspora, except those that are still in Tibet. So he wants to know, how do you deal with that? How do you handle it? And the conversations took place on two levels. One was the political, sort of the geopolitical level, the cultural level. Then there was another level, which was the religious, the spiritual level. That was the monks talking to the Kabbalists, finding out what they had in common and what techniques they had and what they saw and what their understanding of reality was. So that's what we got to do, right? We have to do something like that. We need a program where we actually talk to people this way and say, listen, as I think it was Ronald Reagan who said in front of the United Nations, we have to unite in the face of maybe a threat from outside our solar system, right? The world has to unite. And I never quote Ronald Reagan, if you know me, but in this case, I'll make an exception. So it's like, this is someplace to start, right? He was right. The world's got to cooperate if there really is a danger of colonization. And guess what? If there's no danger of colonization, we haven't lost a thing by cooperating with everyone else, right? So we're not going to lose anything. We may gain something in the process. So we're very much in favor of that kind of dialogue. We need to talk and find out. We need to open our minds and not dismiss people or ideas or countries or religions because of some preconceived idea that it's not worthwhile, it's not as good as ours, or they're not as smart or they're not as civilized, because none of that is true, right? Everybody has their own thing to bring to this table. Everybody's grasping one part of that elephant, right? And there's people grasping parts that we don't know exist. We've got to see the whole elephant. And the only way to do that is to talk to everybody.
Now, if you had to look around the world and find a tradition, an institution, or a person, alive or dead, is there anyone or entity that you think is the closest to understanding whatever small piece we might understand?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because
I know it's a very hard question.
I mean, if you look around here, which you can't really see from where you are, there are literally thousands of books that I'm surrounded by that I've accumulated in my lifetime to try to answer that very question, right? So I have one entire section, which is the Zohar and
Oh, wow.
Kabbalah.
We need to talk about the Zohar. We absolutely have to talk.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
look,
there's
I've heard
all that.
apocryphal stories about it, so please dispel it very quickly. But I've heard it's one of those books that the Kabbalistic tradition tells you you're not supposed to tackle until you're in your 50s and you've had a family and you're a little bit more stable. And you're also, well, you've mastered the Talmud, you've mastered all the, and only then should you partake, because apparently there are, this is the part that's apocryphal, and please correct me because I've never been able to verify it, but there are asylums full of people who've attempted to understand the Zohar and just gone crazy.
Well, okay, that may be apocryphal. Asylums full might be a bit of hyperbole, but there are people who've basically lost it following this line of thinking. There's a lot of problems. The Zohar was written in Aramaic and Hebrew in places, right? But some of the oldest parts of the Zohar are Aramaic. So that's the language that Jesus spoke, right?
Right.
Hebrew was the educated person's scriptures were in Hebrew. So the Torah was in Hebrew. But the Zohar was in Aramaic, and the Zohar was really, about 13th century? So there was a long tradition of Jewish mysticism before the Zohar was compiled. And that tradition of Jewish mysticism involved ascension, celestial ascent, going to the heavens. There was a way that you would meditate, you would get yourself in a particular state of mind, and you would descend to the chariot, as they said, which might be a metaphor for going inside of yourself if the physical body is the chariot, and then rising step by step through the 7 stages to reach the throne of God at the end. And the story that's always told is of the 4 rabbis who attempted this as a group, and they entered the Pardes, they entered the garden to try to make that ascent. And only one made it. One of them became insane, as you mentioned. One died, and one became an apostate. He became totally anti-Jewish, Judaism. The other one made it, Rabbi Akiva. So he was able to make it, and he came back and, revealed some of that process. But there's tricks, there's consciousness tricks, there's traps along the way, and they're only traps if you haven't really, I hate to use the word purify yourself because that has a lot of connotations, but let's say you have to go through a lot of deep therapy before you undertake something like this, because you're going to be forcing yourself into your own mind. And that is a very dangerous place for most of us. We have repressed a lot of information. We've repressed experiences from our earliest childhood, our earliest memories, and maybe from memories that predate our childhood. Who knows? So by going into our consciousness, we are going to encounter things that we're not prepared to deal with. So the key is to be prepared ahead of time, and is to take it slowly and to move slowly through that process. When you get to the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, that is a wild text. It is, well, the best approach to it is to look at the Daniel Matt translation. That's the latest translation. And what Daniel Matt has done is he's basically gone through every single word and phrase. He's given a footnote as to what that really means and how that relates to other words and phrases in the rest of the Zohar or in the Talmud or in the Torah, to make you understand what did they mean when they said this? What were the levels of implication in every statement? It's a trip, right? It really takes you deep into the bowels of human consciousness, the idea of creation. How did creation happen? What's down there in the abyss, right? That serpent, Leviathan, that they talk about in the Old Testament, the seven-headed dragon that's underneath, that actually is the source of creation, based on an old Sumerian tale of a serpent that was destroyed. Tiamat. Because Tiamat is the Sumerian word, and Tehom is the Hebrew word, which is based on Tiamat. It was the same word, the same idea. There was an ocean, there was the face of the waters, as it says in Genesis 1, and there is this, in the Sumerian version, there's a serpent underneath that water. There's like a sea monster, and creation comes out of that. When you read the Zohar, you become aware that there are references to the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, that there is a stone which blocks a hole in the ground. And if you take away that stone, that hole goes into the abyss where creation began. That's the tradition that they have. So you start to see that there's thousands of connections between events and things and mythologies that you never knew existed. And the Zohar kind of gives you all of that. And oddly, it's blamed on one guy, Moses Cordovero, who just sat there and made it all up, right? And everybody kind of knows that really doesn't really ring true for most of the case, but it's in his handwriting. The first copies of it were, he wrote it. It was not printed. It was not published. It was handed around from place to place. There's a lot of scholarship on this now. There's a lot of people trying to figure out where it came from. Certain books are much older than the Zohar proper that are included in the Zohar. But if you understand anything about the Zohar, you know this is the basis for what would come later, the Golden Dawn, right? The occult societies, which were heavily influenced by their understanding of what Kabbalah was. So they would go and read translations of the Zohar. So they're getting it like 2 or 3 times removed, and they're screwing it all up, right? But they're getting the gist of it, though. They're getting the basic idea of it. They're getting a lot of details wrong, but they're getting some of the basic ideas right. And then you had Kabbalists who came after the Zohar. You had Kabbalists in Shabtai Tzvi, for instance, the guy who founded the Sabbateans. Then you have Jakob Frank, who came later, and they really reinterpreted the Zohar. They really reinterpreted Kabbalah their own way. So you can't really blame Aleister Crowley and Arthur Edward Waite and all these guys for misunderstanding the Kabbalah, when the most famous Jewish mystics of the last few centuries also drew their own conclusions, made up their own stuff based upon basic reading of the Kabbalah, basic reading of the Zohar. So it's very messy, but at the essence of it, it's about creation. What is reality? How do we measure creation? What is our role in creation? And how do we get from point A to point B? How do we rise up on the plains to see the throne of God, right? This is all at the basis of all of these initiatory programs, these structures. The Golden Dawn had, and then Crowley later had. All of this was to try to see more clearly into the origins of the human race and the origins of reality. It's a very tall order, virtually impossible, you might say. for any individual person. But cumulatively, they've been giving us a lot of information. And I know we want to talk about the Enochian system at some point, so that it ties into that as well. There's a lot of information that is a reflection of Kabbalistic thinking about the structure of reality.
Why don't we use the Zohar as a bridge for the next episode and just end here? Any final words for the audience?
Wow, how do we sum this up? Where do we go from here? Ladies and gentlemen, in Sekret Machines in the trilogy, we've tried to present, as I said, a series of questions and a lot of strange facts and coincidences that are documented. We provide a lot of documentation. We provide indexes, bibliographies, we footnotes galore. So you can look up the stuff that we're talking about if you doubt it, if you think it's badly sourced. And we're asking you these questions. Think outside your box. If you're really interested in this phenomenon, as I've said many times, if the only books you read about the UFO phenomenon are UFO books, you won't understand the UFO phenomenon, because they're written by people with a particular objective, a particular perspective, an axe to grind. Maybe they're gearheads. They only look at the nuts and bolts. Maybe they're consciousness people. They think in terms of angels and demons. You're going to get really confused and really disoriented and disappointed. What we try to do in these 3 books is to say, yes, all of this stuff is there. It's all valuable in its own way. Here's some questions to ask. Here are some ideas to think about. And that's what we're trying to do. And I think we've been successful, but you're going to be, the proof of that. You'll tell me if we're asking the right questions.
All right, Peter. For folks, definitely check out Sekret Machines. War is the latest, but there's 2 prior volumes before that you should also check out. And thank you, Peter, for your time, and look forward to chatting with you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and you can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.